who is tuning in from wherever you are. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're happy that you're here, and we have an excellent evening planned for you with three fantastic panelists. So whether you're here in Chicago, whether you are online, a hearty Chicago welcome to you, and welcome. Glad that you are here with us. And so our panel this evening is going to be focused on politics, violence, and resistance, which, as I'm sure no one needs to tell you, is an amazingly important topic right now, one that is something that everybody in Chicago should be here listening to this, everybody in the nation should be here listening to this, because this is at the heart of so much going on nationally, globally, locally, you name it. This is important stuff, and luckily we have three experts here to help us walk through this a little bit. So my job, and my name is Kevin Considine. I'm the director of the Robert J. Schreiter Institute for Precious Blood Spirituality and Social Healing at Catholic Theological Union on the south side here. And because, our titles can never be that short, I'm also assistant professor in systematic theology there. So the dual title thing. It's my pleasure to be here to welcome you, to moderate this panel, and to just welcome you all to this discussion here this evening. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our first speaker. And this is Dr. David Buckley from the University of Louisville. And is Louisville okay, or Louisville? Don't want to get you in trouble when you go back home.
Just can't say the S.
Just can't say the S.
I
Gotcha.
get in trouble if you say the S.
All right. So let me tell you a little bit about David. David Buckley is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville, where he also serves as the Director of the Center for Asian Democracy. His research focuses on the comparative relationship between religion and democracy. He was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, serving as Senior Advisor in the Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And we're not done yet because we want you to know how qualified and how great these speakers are. So his first book, Faithful to Secularism, The Religious Politics of Democracy in Ireland, Senegal, and the Philippines, received the International Studies Association's 2018 Book Award for Religion and International Relations. Most recently, he is the author of Blessing America First, Religion, Populism, and Foreign Policy in the Trump Administration, one that I recommend that you check out probably yesterday. And his next book, on the Catholic Church's response to Rodrigo Duterte's drug war in the Philippines, is under contract with Cambridge University Press as we speak. So please give a warm welcome to David Buckley.
Let's see how the height works out. I think the height will work better if I can keep it in my hands, probably. Thanks so much, Kevin, for the warm introduction and to Bill for the invitation to be here, and to all of you for being here. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to an interdisciplinary audience that's thinking about the church in the modern world. The title of this project reflects actually an original theme for the panel that we were at least in draft form given around this concept of marginality, and it actually works really well for this project, I think, in two ways. First of all, I'm going to talk a lot about how the church's ability to address the margins in Philippine society was responsible for the protection it was able to offer in some cases from human rights violations associated with the drug war of President Rodrigo Duterte. So marginality matters to protection. But marginality is also important to the realistic story about the nature of the protection. What I mean by that is it was only marginal protection, and it's really essential that we all bear this in mind. The Catholic Church did not stop the violence in the Philippines. No one did. Roughly 30,000 people were killed. There's been some legal accountability for individual cases, but the ultimate accountability is very much an unfinished product. And so we don't want to exaggerate the nature of the protection. And we want to always have that bigger picture. But with that said, the overall argument of the project that I make with my co-author, Stephen Brooke, is that in local contexts, right, where the church was characterized by both normatively committed religious leaders, both lay and clergy, as well as institutional capacity in especially the urban poor communities where the violence was most intense, that they weren't able to offer a measure of protection, right? So I'll set I'm one slide behind here. I'm in presenter mode. There's the summary. So I'll set the scene a little bit. I'll give just a sense of the overall nature of how protection operated, what I think of as interventions, protective interventions in communities. How did the church basically keep people safe? And then I'm going to give you just a few different snapshots of how marginality factored into this. And I'll walk through those one at a time before wrapping up. Okay, so that animation didn't quite load the right way, but that's okay. We'll run through it in order. For just a bit of context for those who may be unfamiliar, President Rodrigo Duterte was elected in 2016 on a promise to bring a coercive approach to anti-narcotic policy to national government in the Philippines. Even on the campaign trail, there were tensions between the country's Catholic bishops, not all of them, but some of them, and candidate Duterte. In one famous incident, Duterte cursed Pope Francis for causing traffic, to be clear. But he also called the Catholic Church as a whole the most hypocritical institution, and himself alleges sexual abuse at the hands of an American Jesuit during his time in high school. So he was very comfortable kind of playing into this conflict, actually, with the church. The church at the national level did at times speak out, right? But at the grassroots level, the responses were much more uneven, right? Not just within the Catholic Church, but also outside of the Catholic Church. And scholarship from sociologist Jael Cornelio is really essential to check out on this broader context. I'm going to talk today just about the Catholic Church, but it's a broader story that's interesting to know about as well. And the last point that I would just flag is that some of you may be aware, while this is not a story about national level accountability, I'm going to talk about local protection. There is a national and even international dynamic going on right now as Rodrigo Duterte sits in police custody or in International Criminal Court's custody in The Hague. It's a pretty remarkable end to the story. I'm not going to talk much about this. I'm happy to ask questions about it or answer questions about it. It is worth noting, though, that the testimony that he will ultimately confront in his trial is expected to heavily center on witnesses who were protected by church networks. Right? From their grassroots sort of initial protection to their longer term protection, including at times outside of the country. So there is a religious element to that, but it's not mostly what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So as I said at the start, overall in the project, our overall claim is that the Catholic Church was able to offer protection because of this combination of normative commitment and institutional capacity, right? That was present at times, especially in the urban poor communities that were at the center of the violence. Moral commitment involves marginality, actually, as I'll talk about a bit more, especially the ability to deploy counter-narratives with moral credibility to challenge the populist exclusion, right? Some of actually, I think what we heard about earlier really resonates with this powerful moral exclusionary language towards drug users, right, that was directed at these people. International human rights groups had a really hard time countering that narrative. There's some evidence that some of the religious content to the counter narratives that certain Catholic actors deployed may have had a little bit more success. But it's also a story about institutional capacity at the margins. So here, this isn't a kind of theology of marginality, it's physical presence at the margins, right? Especially in urban poor communities that were really at the center of most of the drug war's violence. And so this combination, we try to look at in the project of a kind of moral set of commitments that challenge exclusion and marginality with physical presence at the margins is at the center of the overall story. Okay, we can just skip this slide in the interest of time. Can I skip whole slides? Yeah, but I'll do it click by click. Happy to talk about the data involved in the project, but it's after dinner. Nobody needs a data overview. Let's get to the illustrative stuff. Okay, so what actually happened? Over the course of the research involved in this project, we picked out a half dozen physical interventions that religious leaders operating largely through local parishes, but also sometimes charitable associations of the church, were able to engage in. And we break these down according to three different audiences that they operated through. So first of all, through ties to local state officials. Some, not most, as we'll look at in a minute, but some religious and clergy engaged in attempts to disrupt operations. So engaging in ride-alongs or sort of accompanying physically police on their rounds in urban poor communities. These interventions also frequently took the shape of trying to influence the individuals on the lists that local police and political officials had who were being targeted for violence to get people off of those lists, right, or to resolve inconsistencies in those lists that could be used to target individuals. So these were interventions that clergy were able to make and local religious actors in a way that average human rights organizations found quite difficult. And I'll spotlight a little evidence of that, but that religious leaders had more success with. There was also significant effort at the grassroots level to engage in what became known as community-based drug rehabilitation efforts. This was essentially an initiative to provide an alternative form of grassroots work to address the drug challenges in urban poor communities without resorting to violence. These involved close cooperation, actually, between parishes and local political and police officials. So this was not a kind of prophetic denunciation of violence, usually. This was actually usually an intervention that relied on partnership with sympathetic local police or sympathetic local barangay captains, local elected officials, who were actually looking for an alternative to violence, or at least were open to that alternative, and worked with religious congregations to provide that service in the local communities. So we detail this more in the project, but those operated mostly through the work with state officials. Religious networks also worked extensively with civil society partners. Frequently civil society partners who had technical expertise, but not the local credibility, especially in the urban poor communities where the violence was most intense. So what did this look like? For instance, legal clinics being operated with human rights organizations and civil society organizations who knew how to file court cases, who knew how to document potential abuses, who knew how to technically request a death certificate with information on it, but had no moral ability to access the communities where the violence was actually taking place. Right? Religious actors who had the exact opposite skill set, who had the moral credibility in urban poor areas to be able to say, you can talk to this person, right? Or let's run a legal training clinic for the individuals within our parish structure so that you can then go out and document abuses in your own community, right? So those kinds of partnerships ultimately involved a kind of accountability, potentially in the communities where they were rolled out. There was also extensive work and ongoing work with the widows and the orphans left behind. Right? And this is, again, where the normative side of marginalization comes in, because these were individuals who were still outcasts from their local communities, even after their usually male breadwinner was killed. But because of their association with that violence, they were excluded even after the killing, and therefore very vulnerable, actually, to potential future violence and also just to predation and urban poverty and challenges in their communities. And so there was extensive work in certain, not all, certain parishes, between parishes and some of the psychological professionals. For instance, you could offer counseling to young boys who had seen their fathers killed in front of them, right? Livelihood programs, right, to try to get widows who maybe weren't in the formal workforce before their breadwinner was killed into the more formal workforce so that they would have stability, right? So this kind of partnership model with civil society organizations was definitely something that we saw pretty commonly. Well, I shouldn't say commonly, actually, but regularly, let's put it that way, across some of these urban poor communities. A third set of interventions was more about addressing the local public, right? And these actually might be some of the ones that you would think of first. So first of all, just raising the moral salience of the drug war in local communities through things like sermons, homilies, wakes, vigils, funerals, right? Using those central ritual aspects of especially the clerical function, right? Not just clergy, but especially clergy, to raise the moral salience of the drug war, right? To disseminate messages that were counter to the populist exclusion of drug users. And this was actually the most common single form of response we found in our sort of survey response. And usually centered especially on the priest's ability to focus attention on the moral dimension of the drug war, not just as a police operation, but as a moral crisis in the country. And then finally, this is more of a big picture thing, but it was something that actually did come up pretty regularly, that parishes in general built social solidarity within their immediate surrounding communities. Right? The drug war was fueled by local level accusations of drug usership, right? So neighbors informed on each other. Neighbors settled disputes via the police. Maybe you had a property dispute with a neighbor in an urban poor neighborhood. Maybe you suggested to the police that neighbor was involved with drugs. Maybe that neighbor then was killed 2 weeks later. That sort of process, right? And so we found a lot of evidence that's harder to maybe put a concrete finger on, but that parishes were involved in routine community mediation efforts to build social solidarity, especially in urban poor neighborhoods where residents had moved there recently from the provinces, right, where social capital is quite low, actually, and those kinds of disputes happen pretty regularly. And so parishes were maybe able to turn down the temperature on the neighborhood as a whole, let's put it that way, through their presence in some of these communities. So throughout the broader project, we try to document these 6 mechanisms and their overall existence. In the interest of time, I won't go into, again, the animation's not quite coming up in order. This is legal accountability actually sometimes worked. It didn't always work, but it did sometimes work. This is tied to a nun in a BEC-fueled parish who ultimately got the country's Supreme Court to transfer out problematic police officers, right, in a really remarkable case. This here is Father Flavio Villanueva, who's kind of even gained international notoriety on a certain level for his witness in this area. This is a funeral mass for Kian de los Santos. If there was one case that really kind of was the focal point for some accountability for drug war violence, it was Kian's killing in summer of 2017. This is his funeral procession, which turned into a large-scale protest. And his case is one of the very few where officers were actually convicted of violence. So that's the overall story that we try to tell in the book. We have a survey of parishes in one of the dioceses that was heavily affected by drug war violence. We can't say which one for subject protection purposes, but this is the overall index of how much parishes were doing, right? It's hard to go into the quantitative weeds on this. The point I want you to see, off to the right, those are the most active parishes. Off to the left, those are the least active parishes. And then in the middle are those who did some things. It's an uneven distribution, right? And actually, most parishes were not doing everything, right? So we don't want to exaggerate that. And you would hear frustrations about this even from clergy at some of the more active parishes. But the activity was also real. It wasn't just a couple of outlier parishes, right? It wasn't just a couple of, Franciscans causing trouble. No, it was actually slightly more systematic than that, right? Okay. So I want to give you in the last few minutes just a few slightly more quantitative peeks at aspects of the project that deal with different sides of marginality and the church. The first is just, well, you might be saying, well, what evidence do you have that this actually added up to anything comprehensively? It's hard to prove. Data on the drug war is very imperfect, intentionally so. The best data set related to the drug war was collected by the Ateneo School of Government in partnership with some other institutions, and it shows that there is wide variation across the national capital region. This is Metro Manila, just to get the point across, and it's shaded by a number of killings in this data set, or in the locality, right? Just to get the sense that things were unevenly distributed. Well, we run a quantitative analysis of this data, controlling for a whole bunch of factors, socioeconomically and politically. Let's see if this laser pointer works. Can you see it? You can. It's a bit small in the back. This top line here is showing the effect of having a Catholic parish in your neighborhood. That's a negative effect, right? Killings are going down in that neighborhood, okay? You might think, well, maybe it's just where any house of worship is, right? We coded up some other religious denominations. This here is the Methodist Church. And there's no statistically significant effect, and in fact, insofar as there is an effect, it's sort of mildly positive, although, again, it's not statistically significant, right? Now, this isn't the only part of the story, but this is what the data shows, right? And I think that if it was on its own, I'd still be skeptical about this, but combined with some of the other information that we have, I think it does show that there was this kind of local pattern of protection. Let me say a little bit more about marginality and what we can say about that and how it figures into our story. One really important part to, I think, the protective effects that we saw was the physical presence of Catholic parishes and infrastructure at the margins of society. So the drug war was not equally distributed across the country. It was urban, and it wasn't equally distributed across urban areas. It was urban poor, right? Largely urban poor communities that would have been settled within the last maybe 25 to 35 years or so on the edges of other more established neighborhoods in the national capital region. Okay. One thing that we were curious about was to see whether Catholic parishes were actually present in these neighborhoods. Right? And so what we did was we took data from not just the Archdiocese of Manila, but actually all of the dioceses in the National Capital Region, and basically analyzed it and showed that parishes are equally distributed around the capital region. They're not just in rich neighborhoods, right? They're not just in well-educated neighborhoods. They're in some of these slightly more impoverished neighborhoods. And we think that is consistent with the story that explains why they were able to offer some protection. With that said, there's a great phrase from a recent scholar that Manila is such a patchwork city, meaning it's so locally segregated, right? These urban poor communities really are kind of isolated in some ways. So how did the church reach those communities? Well, what we look at is the concept of a mission station that was rolled out in the Diocese of Caloocan by now Cardinal Ambo David, who was probably the most outspoken of the bishops in Metro Manila about the drug war. He intentionally set up mission stations in these urban poor areas where he didn't have parish infrastructure. And to quote him, these were individuals who were on the margins of the church before this infrastructure existed, but they created the infrastructure, right, in the time of crisis. And in the words of one mission station leader in our interviews, the people who came to the mission stations became his eyes and ears in the slums. That was the point of connection in the marginalized communities, right, that would have been absent for many others. Sorry, the animations are out of order here, but this is the data showing there's not a correlation with socioeconomic status, and this is one of those mission stations staffed by, I think in this case, a Jesuit in one of those urban poor communities. So physical presence at the margins is part of this. A second way that marginality comes in is about the social status of the individuals who are targeted for violence. They were marginalized frequently socially within their own communities. They couldn't advocate for themselves, right? Even if they knew they were on a list as a drug user and it wasn't just, they had absolutely no capacity to navigate the local social structures in a way that would offer them any protection. Local religious elites, not just priests, but also women religious and lay leaders, had more ability to do that, right? And we have a lot of evidence about the ability of local clergy and women religious essentially to get the attention of local political leaders in a way that average people couldn't, or human rights leaders couldn't. This is a great quote from one human rights worker with a very prominent international human rights NGO. It was very different with a priest attending the meeting, right? He was kind of frustrated actually about this fact, but he observed it, and was very confident saying that on the record. This is a slightly more colorful quote from a municipal staffer in one of the cities in the National Capital Region, that the bishop really got on of the mayor and his staff. And the implication was in a way that no other human rights worker could have, right? That the mayor would have simply thrown out somebody from Amnesty International who showed up and did this, or they would have never gotten in the room in the first place. But the clergy had that access in a way that allowed them to advocate for their communities. And then just a great quote from a woman religious in our sample: "Police are scared of angering me. They want to be promoted." And this was a dynamic that, again, I did not understand before doing some of the field work. The commonality of the local social standing of religious leaders in being valuable to police and local civic officials in their own career prospects. The important part of this, I think, is that you don't have to convert this municipal official. You just have to have this municipal official care about their career, right? And we actually have some survey evidence that shows that happened. This is a little survey experiment. I don't want to go into too much detail. On the left, this is a survey of police, Philippine National Police. On the left, we subjected them to criticism from and we told them it was coming from a human rights organization. This is their level of concern about their own career in light of that criticism. To the right, it's the same criticism, but we said it was coming from a Catholic priest, or the Catholic Church, and this is their level of criticism, right? That increased effect. It's not about moral persuasion, but it is about having leverage, right, in a way that the others who are more marginalized would not. The last piece of evidence that I'll talk about, and then I'll wrap up, that's okay, right? Yeah. Is about this marginalization narrative, right? So the way in which drug users and low-level dealers were socially stigmatized and marginalized in their communities. There's a lot of work, a lot of evidence that priests and women religious and laity tried to contest this at times. This is one prominent example of a very famous church in the National Capital Region that displayed images of drug war victims outside of the parish in the run-up to Christmas. This is sort of the central celebration of the universe without being too essentializing. I don't know, right? Christmas is a huge deal, and they displayed these images on the outside of the parish to try to challenge the moral complacency of the people, right? The honest truth is that I think that the evidence of effectiveness of this kind of moral challenge is more uneven, right? It is true we ran a similar survey, and we did show that when religious leaders gave moral messages about the drug war, it had a little bit more of an effect than when that message came from a secular leader. But still, this average line is not very high. It's still pretty low, actually, right? And in terms of its statistical significance, it's right on the edge, right? And so I think, again, that in terms of humility of the takeaway from this project, the work of contesting this marginalization is difficult. It's not easy, and it wasn't something that led to the kind of feel-good story in the short term. But in the long run, I do think that it's one way that local communities were able to mobilize to protect themselves in a very difficult environment. And so glad that we get to tell some of that story. And this is Flavie with Pope Francis. Everybody like? Okay, thank you. Yeah, is this you here? Yeah.
All right, David, thank you very much. Can you give another round of applause, please? Thank you. And one quick point of housekeeping before I introduce our second presenter. I should have mentioned that we'll have 20 to 30 minutes at the end for conversation. So this is, this is not a monologue, this is a dialogue. So if you have questions, comments, anything that comes to your mind, put them either on your phone, in your notes, hold on to them. We're gonna have lots of time for discussion after all three of our presenters have given their say. So it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our second presenter, Atalia Omer. And Atalia is Professor of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She also recently served as Senior Fellow and Dermot T.J. Dunphy Visiting Professor at the Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative in Harvard University's Religion and Public Life program. She earned her PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Politics in 2008 from the Committee on the Study of Religion at Harvard. Her research focuses on religion, violence, and peacemaking, as well as theories and methods in the study of religion. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more because you need to also hear more about how good these presenters are. So, Atalia Omer was awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2017, resulting in the book Decolonizing Religion and Peace Building. Among other publications, she is author of When Peace Is Not Enough, How the Israeli Peace Camp Thinks About Religion, Nationalism, and Justice, and Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians. She is also a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Religion, Conflict, and Peace Building. So please give a warm Chicago welcome to Atalia Omer.
Thank you. I hope you are awake. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. The topic of my talk is actually I'm going to present on very, very fresh research. It's actually my first time to present on this research, but I connect it to my broader work and thinking about religion, politics, and resistance, and specifically interrogating Jewish interrogation of Jewish power and violence. So I thought to start with just a few images that are impressionistic, but the point is to have them in mind, to kind of have them in our conversation, as I'll turn shortly to discussing what I call the Yeshivah of Unlearners. These are Jewish activists in Palestine, Israel, who are interrogating the Jewish tradition as they engage in a lot of deep unlearning and also learning about Palestinian experiences. So here you have an image of just an ordinary routine checkpoint Palestinian experience is very much defined by the occupation of time too. The people who stand there in that, waiting to go through the checkpoint that is occupied by, young 18-year-old, 19-year-old soldiers. They don't know if they'll be able to pass. So there is a very intricate bureaucracy of identification cards to keep, the Jewish spaces safe. This is kind of like the argument. Here are soldiers at the checkpoint who are, deciding if the Palestinians can, move or not. And wait a second. Okay, the images here include. This is a picture of Ben Gvir, who is often visits. He's one of the most Jewish supremacists. I mean, very explicitly. I mean, it's not just me putting the label. I mean, he would call himself that too. Visiting the Haram al-Sharif, Dome of the Rock, and often he does that using the language of I'm Baal Habayit, I'm the landlord, the language of landlord theology. But also he's very much grounded in theology of domination, of Jewish domination, connected to Rabbi Meir Kahana, who is American-born rabbi. Other images below are of settlers' violence that have become very, they go on with total impunity and in an accelerated way since October 7th in the West Bank. So these are images of settlers, and often at the moment you don't know. And last I was there was in January, in December and January, and you really didn't know who was whom, like who was the soldier, who was the settler, and there is no one to call. And so there is total impunity. And the other image on the top is actually from just a couple of days ago, from yesterday, and that was actually basically a pogrom on a synagogue. Because in the synagogue they screened the event that has been kind of established for a few years that is hosted by an organization called Combatants for Peace, commemorating Nakba Day, the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, and the what in the context of Jewish-Israeli narratives is called the War of Independence. So here you see attack on a synagogue. In this context. So I'm putting those images there and with the recognition that it's impressionistic, but I'll be happy to talk more about that. Okay, so I don't know why something is off with the image. Okay, here this is actually an image that I saw in June of 2023. Of a pogrom in a Palestinian village in the West Bank. And it happened on Shabbat. Sorry, I'm confused with two computers. And this is an image of actually what is called the democracy protest during the, right before October 7th and after the very extremist formation of a very extremist government coalition and its intent to go ahead and do what was called judicial coup or judicial reform. And so there was massive protest of many Jewish Israelis who, the image is very striking of the flags and the people who were not there and who were not a part of that, the discourse of democracy were the millions of people who never benefited from democracy. But the connections to the occupation were not made in during the protest of the democracy protest. And then the final image that I want to kind of start with is of Gaza, the genocide at Gaza, that is also undergoing massive ethnic cleansing. Gaza, that was 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees from the Nakba, from 1948. and this is also very much connected, I mean, though I'll be speaking a lot about from the Jewish tradition, but it's connected to Pope Francis, who until his last day, since the genocide started, called the church in Gaza and was very devastated by the reality of destruction. Okay, so so with this, I want to now zoom in on the case of this new movement that is called Small Emuni, or Faithful Left, as it's translated. And it emerged exactly shortly after the November 2022 elections that, as I mentioned, resulted in the formation of Israel's basically most extremist coalition historically. Within the Faithful Left, I will focus further on a small and vibrant subset of activists who have formed a yeshiva, so a learning, space, and a program that they call the Midrasha Emunit, so the faithful house of learning. The Midrasha is basically a program that involves learning from carefully selected Jewish texts of multiple eras. So they do the learning in the morning in a very kind of yeshiva Jewish kind of methodology of learning, utilizing rabbinic methodologies of textual study, and in the afternoon there is a kind of deep dive into the Palestine-Israel conflict, including visits to various kind of solidarity and co-resistance sites, doing a lot of protective presence in various kind of Palestinian geographies, because the geography is extremely fragmented in Palestine, of Palestinian, we can talk more about it if you want. So the morning sessions aim to create a space for the praxis of reaccessing the Jewish Aron HaSfarim, which literally means the book cabinet, a metaphor for the extensive and multi-layered tradition of Jewish hermeneutics. So the Midrasha Emunit, which literally, as I said, means faithful house of learning, was formed shortly after the aftermath of October 7th by young people, primarily based in Jerusalem. One key leader in the Midrasha explicitly seeks, as he told me in our first of many interviews, to challenge, using Jewish vocabulary, the religious Zionist frame that has increasingly dictated reality, like we saw that visit of Ben Gvir to Haram al-Sharif and saying, I'm the landlord, and the pogroms and so forth. So building the Midrasha, he told me, gave me a sense of agency and responsibility. He told me. This person himself came from a town in Israel's periphery in the south, which, by the way, was one of, obviously, the targets for the October 7th. It's in this town where he initially received Mizrahi religious education. So with kind of, this Mizrahi refers to Jews from Arab and Islamic, who trace their roots to Arab and Islamic lands. And then he was accepted to an elite yet isolated yeshiva during his high school years. And he told me, I felt lonely and came across an organization called Mahsom Watch, which means basically watching checkpoints and monitoring checkpoints, and that the soldiers at the checkpoint will treat Palestinians humanely. So he joined Mahsom Watch and heard of a rabbanit, a female rabbi, who was also from the town in the south, in the periphery where he was from. And he said, I joined her through the checkpoints. We did it for 2 years. This is how I came to know many Palestinians and was exposed to their narratives and realities. It was both important and interesting in forming my political consciousness. It is interesting to engage in this learning on the ground at the same time as you pursue intensive Torah learning in the yeshiva. I processed what I saw of the occupation through the lens of the Beit Midrash, of the learning house, of the house of learning, of the Yeshivah, the Torah learning. And then he told me, this process in many respects is replicated in the Midrasha Emunit, in the program. It builds on strengthening infrastructures, especially in Jerusalem, of a network of left circles. And this person specifically is working on shaping the syllabus of what texts are being read in the yeshiva. Okay, so here's an additional quote for him as he was sharing with me about building the syllabus for the learning. I focus on developing a language that is informed by Jewish learning, Safa Beit Midrashit, it's in Hebrew. This is a creative endeavor in producing Torah and rabbinically informed content. And then he continued with something very striking. I believe that our generation is an orphan generation in this respect, and the need is great. It is urgent. I feel a historic tension that drives me. I feel that the Midrasha, the learning center, has potential in this respect, and I see it as an opening, and that something can emerge from it. Regarding the content itself, he said, I try to focus on a historical consciousness that is beyond the voices we have in our generation. In this respect, my temporal axis goes to early modernity. The Midrashic worlds of Poland, and then before that, Sfarad or Castilla, Spain, and then Poland. What thread them together, which makes them relevant to the moment, is that in Poland there is a window of opportunity when Jews have a little bit of power for a short time, and the rabbinic vector during this period is constantly pulling to try to restrain the hubris about property ownership, regardless of whether issues central to modernity, such as sovereignty, that are not yet foregrounded. However, this rabbinic vector challenges the narrative of diasporic powerlessness, which is the kind of the Zionist mythology. It's all about Jewish powerlessness. So this is just kind of an instant to draw on, to challenge that, to disrupt that. So he told me I focus on this to demonstrate that the rabbinic vector is not a reflection of, but rather constitutes a challenge to reality, seeking to restrain the political and economic powers. From there, he continues, I initiate my intervention. Therefore, the peace-building methodology of the yeshiva, as I see it, the yeshiva of Unlearners, is hermeneutical, building on the traditions, polyvocality. One example is how they navigate and wrestle with revenge fantasies that are part of the tradition, like such as Amalek. The Amalek tradition, and I'll be happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. This wrestling with the revenge tradition relates also to the process of unlearning and reclaiming the meaning of holidays and Shabbat, the meaning of Shabbat. And I showed you a picture of a pogrom that happens actually on a regular basis on Shabbat. After they do yeshiva learning and going to the synagogue and all this, so there is a lot of work in trying to reclaim the holidays and Shabbatot, the Shabbat in the plural, from the ideology of Zionism, from idolatry, the idolatry of the state. Okay, so this is another a quote from another interview that I conducted. This person is saying all the Jewish holidays were destroyed in the context of Israel and Zionism. Even Tu B'Shvat, which is where we plant trees, was appropriated into a settler colonial frame. Even planting a tree is violent. Let's plant a tree and cover up a Palestinian village. And she continued, no holiday is not linked to violence. For example, she was talking about her kibbutz, which is called, she grew up in a kibbutz called Ktorah. Ktorah was the third wife of Abraham. And the anniversary, kind of the annual holiday of the kibbutz, is always marked on the Shabbat Chaya Sarah, to mark because of the connection to Abraham. And then she told me, only years later, I realized that this day is used to step all over to temple Palestinians in the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. And in the general Israeli narrative, this parasha of Chaya Sarah, of that moment in the kind of the annual reading of the story, is linked to Hebron. And Hebron is a Palestinian city where a horrific massacre. I mean, there are many events that happen in Hebron, but one specifically that she talked about is of the massacre of 29 Palestinians during Ramadan in the Ibrahimi Mosque, the Cave of the Patriarchs, by the American-born medical doctor, Baruch Goldstein, who was influenced very much by the American-born rabbi, Meir Kahana. That happened in 1994, and tragically, it resulted in imposing basically an apartheid regime in the city, where the street that was, the center of the town, Shohada Street, is now emptied, cleansed of Palestinians, and it looks like a ghost street. And so she continued. This same person who was reflecting about the holidays, every holiday was taken away from me with violence. And she continued. The event of Moed Chaya Sarah that she remembered from her childhood is actually super political and super violent, and this dawned on me sometime during my 20s. My childhood memory of the event was sweet and idyllic and beautiful, and I did not realize that it was predicated on this violence. Reclaiming the Jewish holidays and Shabbatot, it's about challenging the violent and supremacist paradigm, especially when we celebrate it with Palestinians, when we mark holidays with Palestinians in the space. And so they started doing, kind of drawing on the tradition of the Freedom Seders, and to do it within the Palestinian context. So this Yeshivah of Unlearners and also other circles that are adjacent to them has reclaimed the holidays and Shabbatot by making them mostly, marking them mostly in Palestinian spaces when they are invited into them as guests. And they mark them together with Palestinians. And so about this concept of safety and hospitality within Palestinian spaces, another activist said the aim was to gather as guests in a Palestinian venue and feel safe. There is no need for security, weapons, soldiers, just be there. We observed the Freedom Seder near Khair, which is a Palestinian village, and that happened about half a year into the Gaza genocide. And this, they view it as a corrective experience with Judaism. Marking Passover every year has, another person said, has become harder for me to celebrate. And this was a form of repair. Feeling safe in the West Bank, is in itself a political act. We celebrated Passover in a Palestinian space and feel safe. And it's kind of, this is a kind of alternative that we need to produce. Therefore, through this act of marking holidays, a future vision emerges. Okay, so this is another, I don't know if you can see, but to complicate a simplistic approach to religion and political transformation, I share a story from another activist who came from a very, actually from a very extreme. She's a product of one of the most violent settlements in the West Bank, but she had a kind of a process of transformation from that. But she is very deeply connected to her religiosity, and so. So she told me about the Shabbat that they spent again in a Palestinian Bedouin space where they were welcomed into it. but a conflict emerged. One of the organizers, she remarked, can create a very pleasant religiosity, and I'm conflicted about it too, because it challenges the orthodoxy. When I come to Palestinian space and I don't keep kosher because I want to be, they host me. So I'm not going to tell them, she's not eating, pork, but not keep kosher in the same way. So she said, this challenges my halakha and the halachic idea behind it. The other organizer chooses to let go of the halakha a lot. And for me, however, it raises more questions because we need to convey another message to the religious communities. I cannot let go religiously all the time. Such compromises are problematic for the religious world that I am supposed to go back to. We still had amazing spiritual energies together with the Palestinians, and I was thinking, how can I pray with the exact word and feel and have a different intention in two different places and temporalities? And so she talked about how at the end of at Motzah, at the departure of Shabbat, the conflict arose. Some people wanted to perform Havdalah, so to mark the departure of Shabbat, loudly with loudspeakers aimed at the settlements across, very, very violent settlement across. They want to make it loud so that they'll know. And then that raised a question for her. Wait a second, my religion is a protest. When I pray in Havdalah, who do I do it for? Do I do it for God, Elohim, myself, society? What does it mean to transform the Havdalah into a political agenda? And so, with this, I want to turn to the point about Zionism itself, and I mean, I'm running out of time, but I'll indicate just something. Just a little bit. One of my interviewees says it all comes down to Jewish supremacy. When we discuss presumably non-political matters, still it always happens in the context of the occupation and supremacy, and so you can talk about Judaism without talking about the occupation. It is the most pressing issue in Judaism. This includes the question of women's rights in Judaism, but every piece of content that talks about feminism and not the occupation is not feminism. Talking about the question of Jewish supremacy requires wrestling with Zionism, and in response to a question that I posed, what is your relationship to Zionism? Another interlocutor said that it is Chilul HaKodesh, it's blasphemous, almost on the aesthetic level. It is vulgar. There is something in calling a sovereign geopolitical entity a name with so much romantic and mystical and religious baggage in the name Israel. There is something not nice about it, even on the level of beauty or aesthetics, as he framed it. It devours something not by accident, by design. So he talked about being estranged from this. And then he said, I know that I have a privileged position from which I speak because, and then he reflected on his family and his roots, and he said that he talked about how his family is an Ashkenazi family from the old issue, from the old settlement in Palestine. They came in the mid 19th century to Palestine, and they were Ashkenazi, but they were really serious kind of players before the British, so within the Ottoman kind of framework. They were very immersed and active in local politics, and his great-grandfather spoke Yiddish and Arabic. So as I said, they arrived in the late 19th century and were not Zionist. They felt connection to the land, but they were not Zionist. So then he said, well, so I have a privileged access because I can access my family history and derive something from it. I'm connected to this place, so it's not about not being a part of the place. Jerusalem, but because of my family story, I can disconnect. I can disconnect between my connection to this place and the political Zionist frame. And so this last interlocutor illuminates one of the kind of historical sources, in addition to the rabbinic sources, from which alternative political imaginations can be built. Thank you.
So please, one more round of applause for Atalia Omer. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce our third presenter of the evening, and her name is Mwila Mulumbi. And allow me to introduce Mwila with a little bit about her so you can know some of her work and what she is about. So with an academic background in sociology focused on power, participation, and social change, Mwila Mulumbi has always been interested in amplifying the voices of women and young people in leadership. The governance of poverty, civil society and civic space, gender justice, and the role of disadvantaged citizens in holding public authorities to account, among many other issues. Through previous roles as Executive Director of the Civil Society for Poverty Reduction and as a country representative for CAFOD in Zambia, she has led numerous projects to enhance sustainable development, tackle barriers to equity, and foster community empowerment. Some of her research interests have addressed critical questions about poverty, inequality, and power in relations to inclusive development. Previously, she was involved through the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University in a 4-year real-time research project to understand how the everyday aspects of people's lives were responding to global economic shocks. Her writing from this research includes Eat With Us, Insight into Household Food Habits in a Time of Food Price Volatility in Zambian Communities, and also a series of reports including Zambia, Findings from the Life in a Time of Food Price Volatility Study. So it is my honor and pleasure, and please give another warm Chicago welcome to Mwila Mulumbi.
Okay, well, being the last one sucks. I don't know. I hope everyone is awake. So I'm really grateful to be here. It's definitely obviously my first time. So I really appreciate being amongst such distinguished people. I feel like an imposter because I know most of the people here are scholars, researchers, theologians. So I'm just a simple activist working for an organization called CAFOD. Yeah, but it's a privilege to be among you, and I hope I have an opportunity to be able to learn much from you in these 2 days. Yeah, so my presentation is based on my lived experience. So as I said, I work for an organization that is trying to work to alleviate poverty across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so on. I live in Zambia, so my experience obviously is in terms of what I'll share with you is based on that. And the title is Resisting Despair, How Zambia's Debt Crisis Fuels the Practice of Hope through through solidarity, spiritual resilience, and advocacy. So I will give, in terms of just an outline, overview, I think just talking about how this debt crisis came about, and how it spiraled, who it has hurt the most, and why it's just not about numbers, but it's really about people. So I'll try to set the scene for Zambia's debt as a moral as well as structural issue. I'll highlight briefly about just the climate change as a crisis multiplier, but I think in the interest of time, will not delve too much into that. Then I'll zoom in on the lived reality of marginalized communities, especially rural women, smallholder farmers, who are obviously impacted by the debt crisis. So I'll share stories and data that show how inequality intersects with debt, and climate chaos. Then I'll talk about some of the pathways of hope, how Zambians resist despair. I'll introduce the central theme. Zambians are not just passive victims, but they are practicing hope as resistance through some, interconnected pathways. And I'll end with final reflections and conclusion. So just an overview of the debt crisis. Is there a pointy thing? On the screen, okay. Okay.
They can see that.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to highlight, so most of you that don't know where Zambia is, so that's the little landlocked country there. There's Congo DRC there, so it's pretty much, landlocked. So I'll talk about, obviously, that, but I needed to show this map so that you get an overview of the debt crisis. And what does it really mean when we say a country is in a debt crisis? So this is where debt payments undermine a country's economy and or the ability of its government to protect and the basic and economic and social rights of the citizens. And so today we have more than 50 countries that are actually classified as debt crisis. So this map was generated in 2024. So it's possible that there could be slightly more. So one in every 4 countries that's globally are in a debt crisis. And I think as we sort of celebrate this sort of year of Jubilee, if you recall 25 years back, there was this massive campaign to try to obviously get rid of debt, particularly by the highly indebted countries and so on. And I think a biggest question that obviously arises is how then did we come to this, stage where the debt is now crippling? And actually in this particular case, when you compare the debt that was there in 1980, 90, it's even more crippling than obviously what was there. And there was, there were obviously a number of efforts, things that were done and so on at that particular time to bail out. I think some of these countries that actually are in debt crisis were some of the countries that were bailed out. But at that particular time, there were some issues that were not addressed in terms of just the way, particularly the private companies that were lending to particularly the indebted countries, the structures of just that lending system and so on was not really dealt with. So obviously IMF came in with a package to sort out the private companies and so on, but unfortunately they did not deal with that sort of structural issues that obviously funneled all these sort of, a debt to the poor countries, and the desperation obviously that was there from the poor countries. So we have sort of found ourselves back, but then there are so many other factors, obviously I think COVID happening, the pandemic and so on, so there were a number of other factors that have obviously fueled the current crisis, but I'll sort of talk about that a bit as I talk about Zambia. So with Zambia, the debt crisis is not only just an economic statistic, it's a lived structural injustice with daily consequences for the majority of the poor. So the country's external debt currently stands over 15 billion. So the statistics was actually by 2024. There has been no borrowing, so I can't tell you what it is now because I think the sort of country obviously has seized that. And some of the root causes, as I've said, some of it is historical, but I think some of our countries obviously are quite to blame as well. There's been this aggressive borrowing for obviously many reasons, borrowing for infrastructure, some of it also for spending, but most of it has not been very, in terms of quite clear where some of the funding has gone in. So there's obviously been issues of, corruption and so on. But then there's also been volatile global markets. There's been high interest from private, creditors and particularly from, for example, Eurobonds. And then the pandemic, and there's been various climate shocks, particularly in the Southern Africa region. Then we've also had the Ukraine war, which have all battered, the country in terms of just increased inflation, but then also just currency and just raised also some import costs for the country. So when we look at what this really means in terms of the morality and structural aspects of it, we do find that it's, as I said, it's an economic failure, but it's also a justice issue. We find Zambia being caught in what economists would call a debt trap, but then what maybe theologians would understand as a form of modern day sort of structural sin. With Zambia's debt, as I said, it really did stem partly from the sort of structural financial architecture that was obviously in place or embedded by the creditors. We had countries in the global south mostly obviously trying to borrow, particularly in the last sort of decade, trying to borrow for climate change. But then when you look into the debts, you would find that they were quite punishing. They had very punishing terms in terms of just the high interest rates and so on. And creditors sort of demanded repayment while communities sort of went hungry. And then we also found that when debt is being discussed in terms of the restructuring, so in Zambia's country, the case, for example, we had 3 years ago where the debt had accumulated to a point where if the country had to pay per month the debt, they would have had to pay 90% of the revenue that the country was making on a monthly basis. So there had to be that sort of discussion to sort of restructure that debt, but it took a long time for the creditors, and most of them obviously private, to sort of move or agree to sort of reduce the debt, which currently stands at 55%. Then just to now move on to how Zambians are living in this sort of debt, what is the reality and so on. So you find that the crisis, the fiscal crisis, as I said, is just not about numbers, but it is about people. So we've actually had a number of Zambians, mostly women, who have obviously been affected, whether it's through the agriculture sector, which predominantly most of the rural women in Zambia work in. It has been women that are just trying to make a living in the informal sector, and so on. And so the government's decision then to sort of slice the cake, so as I said, 55% of the Zambia's revenue has been going towards servicing external debt, so leaving 45% to the other sectors, so agriculture sector and other sectors like education, health and water and so on. And usually in terms of how to slice this cake has actually been, sorry, can I get this pointer thing completely gone now? Because I think it's, okay.
Turn it off.
No, it's back on.
Maybe you're trapped.
Because I think it's distracting the. Hang on.
Can you bring this?
Bring it back?
Not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. No, it's trying to get the pointer away just so it doesn't distract.
Yeah, because it's distracting the. Because I'm trying to get to the notes, but then it's like it can't move. I think so. Laser? Okay, great. Okay, great. So we've had women definitely affected, especially when we look at some of the climate devastation, the economic collapse. We find that women really bear the brunt. And as I said, it's really the slicing of the cake has taken a toll, particularly on the social sectors, which usually act as safety nets or as protectors to the women. Just to also highlight that farmers especially, I mean, the Zambia's economy is predominantly dependent on farming, and we have 70% of the population that work in that sector. So farming has been one of the sectors that has been highly impacted with particularly, obviously, the smaller allocation to the agriculture sector. But I wanted to paint a more vivid impact on how debt has actually impacted the household in Zambia, but using the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection Basic Needs and Nutrition Basket. So JCTR in Zambia is a moral voice in Zambia's struggle for economic justice and has tracked the cost of living through this basic needs and nutrition basket. And they sort of carry this as a monthly, they monitor the minimum cost of for a family of 5 people in terms of how they are meeting their needs, that is food, shelter, healthcare, education, and transport. And they are then, I mean, so this is done across various districts, so the picture looks quite different. So the food basket, for example, for Lusaka would look quite different from another one in a rural area. So they are always tracking how these essential needs, food, shelter, healthcare, education, and transport look like for each of these districts. So just to give an example, in March 2025, the JCTR B&B for Lusaka stood at $380, which in contrast, obviously, to the sort of, and the majority of, in Lusaka, which is a city, the majority of the people tend to work in the informal sector. And so in terms of the average income of the people that work in the informal sector, this is about 80 to 145. So when you look at, obviously, what the basic needs, for a family of 5 to be able to have good shelter, healthcare, education, and so on, they would need 380, but then you find that their income ranges between 80 and 150, which obviously translates into way less than obviously what is required. And then this gap is more than obviously economics. It's immoral. As I said, the government has, because of trying to service the debt, has been allocating very little towards social protection. So there's no safety net, obviously, for these individuals that are barely managing to meet their own costs and so on. So usually then it becomes almost, these families making these impossible choices. So do they buy medication, or do they pay school fees? Do they eat 2 meals a day, or do they stretch food for an extra week? Do they take a loan for fertilizer or cover transport to the clinic and so on? So it continues to be the sort of, this moral economic of despair, which JCT obviously tries to reveal through this basic needs. So the basic needs literally tries to expose this moral economic in which the cost of basic dignity is unaffordable to most. So Zambia's economic fragility is obviously exacerbated by the external debt crisis, worsened by climate, as I said, induced shocks, which creates, obviously these sort of structural issues that families cannot particularly get out of. So why does this matter in terms of just the basic needs? As I said, the basic needs, it's more than just obviously trying to show statistics. It's a tool that's really meant to sort of, show that the priority over profit, which, obviously governments, those that are lending, focus on, are obviously inhumane. Debt service over human service and economic matrices over moral accountability. The basic needs becomes more than just a statistic. It's more, in Zambia we use it as a moral thermometer measuring the temperature of just sort of the injustice in society under obviously the sort of economic siege. Then it also, we use it as sort of an economic instrument that is, it acts as a mirror to government, obviously. I mean, because sometimes it's when the government is sitting, trying to obviously sort of determine how they will slice the cake. Without this sort of mirror, it becomes obviously hard, and sometimes the cake can be sliced in a way that obviously then continues to sort of bring pain to Zambians and so on. So quickly, I have a few minutes. So in terms of some of the pathways, I wanted to just highlight how Zambians are then trying to sort of resist and trying to sort of choose, live differently during obviously what we have termed as a crisis that has literally paralyzed homes. So Zambians are trying to respond to the crisis in 3 pathways. So community solidarity, spiritual resilience, social justice, advocacy. And most of these responses are highly rooted in obviously land, the faith, the memory of how Zambians have dealt with past shocks in the past and so on. And just to quickly move on to pathway 1, which is really solidarity and so on. So the survival has come from, not from institutions within Zambia, but it's really been more of the people from the margins. So these are individuals, ordinary men, women, who sort of come together, neighbors feeding each other, youths working together, women pulling coins into a life-saving, crisis and so on. Then across Zambia, you find that obviously the grassroots initiatives they have sort of emerged as a way of trying to obviously deal with this crisis or sort of work in sort of solidarity. And we have some examples which I'll quickly share of models of these initiatives that have arisen. So we have local savings schemes, we have cooperatives and grain banks. And these models really have sort of shaped the sort of grassroots kind of economy, rooted obviously in sort of this mutual responsibility. We have this terminology also called Ubuntu, where I am because you are. So it's sort of this shared survival. So for me to survive, you also need to sort of survive. So the first example, just under this sort of community solidarity, is this local savings schemes. I'm sure these are quite common or you've heard about them, but they've really sort of emerged as a powerful form of financial self-determination, where obviously, there are no safety nets within the country, but then communities are able to pool resources together. And these sort of, village banks act as sort of social trust, serving both as economic, but then also as serving the emotional needs of communities. And we just have an example here in one of the communities where we work in, Mwila group savings, where members save weekly and access, these micro loans, and women in this group fund different things. Farming inputs, student school fees, and small businesses, and so on. And their stories actually are well reflected through one of the theologians in Zambia called Father Peter Henriot, who once called this as, faith in motion. So constantly, people sort of working together with this sort of faith in motion, where economic resistance becomes a moral act of shared hope. And another sort of closely linked initiative are these sort of cooperatives. And again, maybe these are things that you find common in communities, but they've sort of emerged. They have been reshaped, I think, for communities to be able to work together in solidarity. And so this is where marginalized Zambians, mostly farmers, they sort of work together to pool resources together. And usually these help in terms of just trying to cushion, against rising, input prices and climate shocks and so on. And these cooperatives have really been effective in terms of trying for these marginalized farmers trying to resist economic isolation and building sort of community economies of care and production and so on. And this is just, I think, one of the examples there in terms of supporting particularly female-led food systems where members, again, access land together, inputs, markets, and help each other. And then another initiative is these grain banks. They are mushrooming again. It's one of those initiatives that was initially there but has become more pronounced, I think, because of obviously the sort of crisis that communities are going through. So these grain banks, they sort of act as a storage, or sort of if you think of a bank account, but this is not a bank account for an individual, but then a bank account that others can draw on when there's hunger and when there's need, for example, for seed to be grown and so on. And just a quote there where it says, "The grain bank is our insurance. When hunger comes, we go on begging. we go to our own. So these individuals are relying on each other in the moments when obviously hunger is there. So how many minutes do I have? Oh, 3 minutes. Oh, wow. Okay, so just a quick reflection on just the aspects of solidarity. So we see that obviously these examples of cooperatives, the saving schemes, the grain banks, and so on, they act as seeds, a form of what Pope Francis called people-centered development, rooted obviously in solidarity, sustainability, and subsistence with dignity. They are just not survival strategies, but they are seeds of Jubilee economy, a spirit of global solidarity, which also demands that at least a significant reduction in the debt burden of the poorest nations is sort of dealt with. I think just to sort of end on these initiatives, they spring up everywhere, and they definitely stand as some sort of form of prophetic defiance, which obviously where ordinary people in the most marginal spaces are building sort of these extraordinary models of help. I had other examples, but I'll just sort of, there were other pathways that I needed to share, but I'll still be able to, I don't know if I can print the presentation, Marlon, and just sort of share it with people, because there were just quite a number of other things I needed to share. And particularly in terms of how then the basic needs basket, sort of going back the full circle in terms of how then it becomes both as a tool for monitoring, but then also as a tool to be able to engage with the government, to be able to engage whether through songs and so on, as a grassroots sort of advocacy tool. So I shall end here, and if there are any other questions, please do ask. All right.
Okay, and please, one more round of applause for all of our great panelists. And so, okay, we have a microphone that's coming to the middle, and now is one of the best times of the evening, so it's our chance to engage in discussion with our three esteemed panelists. So I believe we're on Facebook Live, so if you're on Facebook Live, we have folks that are manning the computers, so please put questions or comments there. They will alert us immediately. If you're here in the room, please step up to the mic, and if you have questions, comments, and please introduce yourself so we know who you are, and if you have a question, if it's to a specific panelist, to all three, just help us to know kind of who you would like to begin to address your question.
Thank you very much. My name is Father Stan Chu Ilo. My question goes to you, Atalia. I would like to, if you can, unpack a bit the revenge tradition. You spoke about the story of the Amalekites, and whether you see some resonance to what is happening in Gaza between that revenge tradition and how in the process of revenge, how the person, the victim of this revenge, whether the suffering is who listens to the suffering or of the one who receives this act of revenge. Is it the same God or another agent? Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be brief because there is a lot there. But I actually really dedicated now months to going really deeply into the Amalek tradition and how it's deployed. And of course, Amalek, I mean, they use the deployment of Amalek by Netanyahu and other politicians is very prominent in the case, the South African case in the International Court of Justice. the genocide. Calling what is happening in Gaza genocide. So I do have actually an article that is coming out in the Journal of Genocide Research, tracing Amalek, and also connecting it in the specific context of Palestine, Israel. It was in conjunction with the language of Amalek, which also activated, you have to understand it within kind of a broader discursive context where it activates Islamophobia, and also calling, another kind of Manichaean discourse of, calling Palestinians Nazis, which it all operates in moving us away from the actual context and the context of political violence, of apartheid and occupation, and make it into this kind of like ahistorical, decontextualized framing. But what is interesting is that, first of all, Amalek, the language of Amalek was used in the context of settler colonialism in the United States, Manifest Destiny. And so, the argument that I'm making is actually that reading of Amalek, this biblicalism, kind of the literal, is very much rooted in in the fact that actually Zionism as a movement, as a political movement, first of all, Christian Zionism predated Jewish Zionism, and it also disconnected. Zionism itself is actually, as many of the people that I've engaged with in that space that I shared, make an argument that Zionism as a political movement really also, in addition to negating Palestinian and denying Palestinians' humanity, is basically also negated the Jewish tradition itself, and that also manifests in how the Amalek tradition, and also other traditions like that manifest very, very visibly in the context of Gaza. You see discourse of Amalek everywhere. It's so ubiquitous. It's not just the politicians. There is a very, there are celebrations of, for instance, Purim, Esther, the reading of the Megillah in Gaza with shooting and writing everywhere on destroyed Palestinian places. This is for, you'll never forget Amalek, never forget Amalek, and so this discourse is very ubiquitous. And it's connected in the context, in this particular context, also to another discourse about miracle, that actually October 7 is a form of miracle. For what? Miracle for what? For the settler colonial move of ethnically cleansing, especially in the West Bank. So you hear settlers talk about that. But what is important is, I'm always referring to the work of actually Jewish Israeli scholar who is very much centers the exile, thinking about exile in the context of the land, and he talks about Zionism as a form of the colonization of Jewish consciousness by Christian imagination about the Jews. His name is Amnon Ras-Karkotskin, a really amazing scholar who takes, he is very influenced by Benjamin conception of history and so forth. And so what is to go back to Amalek and the fact that the very a reading of the realities, of the political realities through this prism is actually deeply, deeply anti-rabbinic. Because if you go into, and this is what I trace in this forthcoming article, if you go into the ways in which the rabbis engage with this tradition, you see different maneuvers, because Jewish hermeneutics is not about supersession. It's not about saying, you have to continue to wrestle with the text, but you are thinking with the text, but basically the rabbis in various ways theorize the possibility of Amalek out of existence through a variety of mechanisms, including making, in kind of Hasidic traditions, making it into it's kind of like a greater jihad, kind of like internal struggle against, impious thoughts. For instance, there is a whole tradition that deals with Amalek in this way, or revenge is really, revenge, it's important to keep that sense of revenge because it's about sense of justice, but you let God do that. in some ways. And so you have all those traditions and layers that are thinking with the text, or because this is what it means to work within a tradition, but very much connecting to that. But literal reading would be actually in many of the people that I've kind of engaged with and how they draw on the tradition. They say this is a radical departure from the tradition, and you cannot understand it in the context without understanding, again, other mechanisms of dehumanization of Palestinians, like Islamophobia.
Thank you very much for the panelists. Emmanuel Katongol is my name. This is from Mwila. These examples that you provide of grassroots, in a way, coming together, the savings clubs, the grain banks, obviously they are drawing from indigenous or native or African traditions of Ubuntu, of solidarity. But we also know that Zambia is a predominantly Christian country. So I'm wondering how much of that is also connected or draws from or is organized around congregational life, if there is anything like that that is also inspired or is connected to the religious sentiments and practices of Christianity in Zambia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Actually, Zambia was declared as a Christian nation, I think, a decade ago. Part of my presentation, the next few slides, I was going to talk about just where that, in terms of the faith, comes from. First of all, there is obviously a role that the church plays through whether it's holding vigil prayers. So we have, for example, the Churches Council of Zambia and the Zambia Bishops' Conference have held actually have this day where they bring together people to pray, praying either for peace, but then also just talking about injustice and so on. They hold vigil, so we also have liturgy sometimes focused on these aspects of this economic injustice and so on. So there is a lot that is done at that level, but then in terms of just at community level, we have these different groups, particularly of women, of women and young people that come together. So whether it's through song, as you know, I think not only in Zambia, but I think across Africa, songs tend to sort of carry these stories. So whether it's stories of lamenting, so lamenting about the injustices, and through that lamenting, sort of then having dialogue after that lament in terms of what communities can be done sort of together. So there is a lot of that being practiced. Obviously, as I said, prayer vigils being held. Not only, I guess, those that are coordinated by the church, but then just coordinated by individuals and so on. So it is, I think, a big role. I mean, faith definitely has a big role in terms of just how Zambians are sort of responding and obviously building on hope. In addition to these sort of initiatives that they do run at community level.
Bill Kavanaugh. So this is a question for David. So David, the way you presented some of the findings and the statistics, you were being quite modest about the effect of the parishes, but the article by you and your team that I use for my class, I thought the statistical payoff was that there was about a 30% decrease, like in a neighborhood with a Catholic parish, there's like a 30% drop in the death rate, which I thought was pretty dramatic. So could you kind of expound on that a little bit? It seemed like you were being too modest. What's the relationship between that and what you presented?
The old line about lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? It's good to be modest. I think so. It's true, right? If you run the way the stats add up, the estimate is that a similar neighborhood that has a Catholic parish to one that doesn't, roughly 30% less violence, and I believe that effect. I think it's robust statistically, right? We control for the census, socioeconomic status, we do all that we can to control for things. The reason that I do hesitate a little bit with just that finding is that you're always going to wonder, are the Catholic parishes somehow non-randomly distributed, right? So in other words, is the reason the statistical effect is there still because there's just something that's different about the neighborhoods that happen to have a Catholic parish in them, and it's that unobserved characteristic that is the reason why they are less violent. It's not because of the parish, it's because the churches are in slightly advantaged neighborhoods in some way. Now, we try to control for that quantitatively, right? But if it was only the quantitative effect, I would worry about that, because you'd worry that there's some omitted variable, is what we would say in stats research, that's really driving the relationship. So it's not the parish isn't why there's less violence, it's because the neighborhoods that have parishes are also better supplied with electricity or something like that. We try to control for all that we can, but I do think it's good to be humble still about that. But it is true that the finding is very robust, and all of this other stuff is going on, right? We have all this other evidence, and that's where I become more confident, because it's not just that one quantitative finding, but a lot of qualitative field work and other things too. So. Sure.
When I did field work in the Philippines in 18, 19, 20, many of the religious actors, including Catholic actors in different spaces, were okay with road territory.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So it's we have the clergy, the official interviews would usually hesitate to enthusiastically endorse the drug war. What they would do is maybe raise doubts about the extent of the abuses, right? So they would say, oh, okay, well, this is just one or two kind of bad cases, but overall, that's not fair, right? There's those are just a few bad cases, but overall the campaign is good. Yeah. You don't, in Catholic circles, you didn't find as much of the full-throated endorsement of the campaign. There would have been evangelical megachurch pastors who were very enthusiastic, right? We have some very dramatic interviews of pastors, with a engraving of the Gustave Doré print of David holding up the severed head of Goliath, and the caption on it is kind of a Christian approach to anti-narcotic policy. Right? So it speaks for itself. So that did go on. That dramatic kind of endorsement was a little, that didn't happen as much in Catholic settings. It was more subtle support. We do find that when that essentially the priests who had those views, their parishes didn't engage in as much of this activity. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Quinn Walser. I work here. My question is also directed at David, and it may not be a fully fleshed out question, but I think it would be kind of remiss to have an event, a World Catholicism event, without mentioning the conclave right now, and more specifically the presence of a Filipino candidate in the conclave. No, if we were to have a Filipino pope, how do you think that would change attitudes towards Catholicism in the Philippines, if it would at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Cardinal Chito.
You have intel?
No, I have no intel. Cardinal Chito is beloved, right? He is absolutely beloved. He's a very effective communicator. I think Filipinos would be extremely happy if that happened. He was in Manila during the drug war for much of it. He was eventually but Francis called him to Rome. And I think it's fair to say that in his leadership role in the Archdiocese of Manila at that point in time, he cultivated he tried to maintain engagement with the state and with actors in the police who he thought it was important to minister to. And that didn't mean that he didn't say things that were critical, but he was not necessarily somebody who cut off ties and refused to have meetings and that sort of thing. He was a kind of pastoral presence. I think that's who he is. But I think it's also fair to say he was not someone who is the most outspoken or the most maybe prophetic voice among the hierarchy. And I think that's who he is. So that's what I would expect of his approach if he were in that role. Yeah.
Okay, I know I already had a question, but I'm going to take another one if that's all right. Atalia, I want you to just talk a little bit more about what it means to be a non-Zionist Israeli. What is the vision that the folks that you're talking about, what is their vision for the future of Israel-Palestine? Do they want a two-state solution? Do they want a state where everybody has, like a one-state solution where everybody has equal rights? Or are they just at the level of not thinking about, you know, a blueprint for the state, but rather just these kind of local, you know, places of resistance? What would be the goal?
Yeah, so they are very diverse. I didn't get a lot into it, but the people who converge, so it is an intense program, but it's within kind of broader circles. So there are people kind of, but these are kind of hardcore, more hardcore people, activists, but they are very diverse. So you see in that space people who come from the Haredi community. So for them, it's actually much easier than the secular, you know, the truly the religiously illiterate secular Israelis. I mean, I was incubated in that space myself because because for the Haredi, people who come from the very kind of orthodox, for lack of an actual translation to that concept, you know, Zionism is such a modern. You know, it's so modern, it's so new. Zion is not. There is a difference between Zion and Zionism, right? So in many respects for the Haredi, people who kind of are attracted into that space, and sometimes ex-Haredi, people who already escaped the Haredi community for a variety of reasons, often because they're LGBTQI plus people, and end up in kind of circles in Jerusalem or, and are starting to kind of interrogate. So for them, it's actually, you know, they have the depths of the tradition to draw on. And they also have the depth, the historical depth of being in the land in Palestine. This is what I kind of ended with, that historical, drawing on that other historical model of being in the place, being in the space, and, you know, not being in position of domination. And part of, so for the Haredi people, a lot of the learning is about understanding, you know, where they live, because often they live, you know, they grew up in enclaves communities. So they learn about, you know, they go to Hebron and they see and they engage in protective presence and co-resistance work, and it's very transformational. And so you have this, and then you have people who grew up in more kind of secular framework, but there is no such thing because it also draws on a particular narrative of Jewish history that is, you know, kind of the early images that I showed really depict what, again, going back to Amnon Raskakotski's famous phrase that, you know, secular Israeli Jews, you know, don't believe in God, but God gave them the land. And it captures a lot about, and so they need to do a lot of learning about, you know, the Jewish tradition and understand how, and think about what does it mean to be Jewish in the space, but not be in a dominating position. And then you have people like one of my interlocutors that I shared with you, who comes from really very, very extreme settlement in the West Bank. So she has, as an example, in a sense, an agenda to go back to her community because she loves them. She doesn't hate them, and tell them, hey, I was able to, you know, to turn around, and we should, and also develop friendships. Part of it through that. It's not like a simple contact thesis. These are really deep relationships that are built. It's kind of from the ground up. They doesn't come with a prescription. They just like they are together. And often resist together the military that is coming on them, and you know they, so there is all of a sudden from different angles there is realization that, you know, that realization that they were fed lies, and a particular kind of storyline that is very strong. It's extremely strong, the ethos. And so there is this unlearning, but then recognition that, there were other ways of living in the space that were not, that, Jews, Muslims, Christians, whoever, they live together in different ways. And the principle is, yes, of equality for some, that kind of like, what does it mean to center really the principle of equality and think across the geography? What does it mean to be equal from the river to the sea? And also think about historical accountability for what crimes, but for some of the Haredi people say, I'm even though I'm here, in the land, I'm in exile. So there is kind of a reconnection to the concept of being in exile, because the concept of return is something in meta-historical time. And so the point is about a principle of equality and recognition. There is a lot of critique of the so-called two-state solution because it's based on a principle of ethno-religious separation, and so that is in a contradiction with the principle of equality. And so there is a realization of that. So.
It's me again. I think I have a question that I think all three of you might be able to answer in form of dialogue, because I see that the three presentations, you're looking at the government of the day in Philippines, in Israel, in Zambia. They're going in a different direction that is affecting the common good, affecting the people, affecting others outside even of that particular country in question, in this case Israel. Now, the counter narrative of the sites of resistance that we find in Zambia or in Israel or in Philippines against Duterte. Now, it seems that this is a cycle that we see all over the world as we have this rise of corruption, autocrats who exploit religious narratives, often like Zambia is a Christian country. What is the solution to finding governments that are accountable to the people? Because these counter-narratives, we've seen that before. In Philippines, there was an uprising against the Marcos. And we can think of the great uprising against Kenneth Kaunda. So it's like you have 2 steps or 1 step forward, 5 steps behind. How can we have governments that can actually work for the people to create and institutionalize hope and create the good of order?
Small question. Do you want to start?
Wow, that's quite a lot. So one of the things, when I look back at, for example, the Jubilee 2000 campaign, one of the reasons it was actually quite effective and led to debt cancellation was there was involvement of people literally on the ground. We've seen over the years, I think from that period to now, where there's been these sort of elitist civil society, people that have mobilized themselves, people more in the sort of capital city wanting to speak, obviously, on behalf of those that are poor or those that are facing the most injustice. And we know usually when those people sit across, the government obviously tends to even question, like, who are you speaking on are you speaking on behalf of your own, elitist group, or are these voices filtering in from the community? And so, particularly in my context, where we have seen, and I was just sharing with somebody on the table, that we have actually had a change of government, which is quite rare in Africa, where you constantly have, you tend to see
presidents sitting in power positions for many, many years. But then we've had actually examples in Zambia where after 5 years we have a new president, so the democracy is obviously growing. And one of the biggest influences has been obviously how people have mobilized themselves on the ground, particularly young people. And so when the voices of people, when there's that protest from people that literally feel the pain, there's definitely a tension that it brings to obviously those that hold power. And I think obviously sort of shifting from this, and one of the things in my organization actually we've been trying to promote, and I'm sure most of you have heard this, sort of shifting the power, decolonization, whether it's talking about local agency, voice and accountability, it's something that we're trying to emphasize where as a North sort of agency, obviously with some level of power and funds and so on, we sort of realize that when we sort of try to push for reforms or try to bring about accountability, it doesn't work unless the power literally sits with those obviously that sort of are in the midst of the despair, or if it's conflict and so on. So we have actually begin sort of seeing again changes or transformation happening where there's sort of shifting the power or decolonization, or whether it's localization, whatever you might want to call it. But then it's also, one of the discussions we've also had is with actually the bishops as well. So we see that bishops can actually be an elitist group when they obviously sit across the table trying to advocate on issues with governments. We have actually begun to see in Zambia where there's now this sort of friction between our bishops and the current government. But when I think those, what the bishops are trying to say is then filtered in or comes through the voices from ordinary men and women, we sort of begin to see that change. But I guess it's a very hard question in terms of because obviously there are other dynamics in terms of just the strength or the platforms that are provided for those voices to filter in. But yeah, at least in the Zambia context, definitely that's one of the things that for me, when I going back to the Jubilee 2000 campaign, sort of moved the needle in terms of the actual debt cancellation.
Yeah, Mwila used a word that I was thinking of, also the kind of the potential elitism, right, of some of the some aspects of the pro-democracy movement, including the church at times in the Philippines, right, I think is one of the challenges that movement has faced, and a sense of kind of becoming detached from the people, and therefore you have a populism, a kind of law and order populism that's quite popular, right, even in the communities where the violence is going on. So what's the answer to that? Well, to actually the process of moving the church to the margins, I think, is part of the answer to that. And this is where we don't mostly tell a top-down story, or we try to tell as much of a local story in the project as possible. But the top-down does matter. It matters that Bishop Ambo got made the bishop of one of the most impoverished dioceses in the country, and that he put his resources into the urban poor communities with these mission stations, that he put seminarians there, that he brought religious order seminarians in when his own seminarians didn't want to go. I think some of them did, but not all of them. Like that mattered, and now he's a cardinal, right? That's not an accident, right? So the leadership does matter, and I think that Francis clearly had a sense of the need globally for the church to reestablish itself at the margins. And that takes time, and none of this is easy. But I think in the long term that is a path to sort of a renewed kind of moral presence in public life. The only other thing I'd briefly say is we, as part of our survey research in the general public, we basically tested out how people reacted when the clergy got involved in criticizing the drug war, and because we were wondering if people would react negatively, basically, right, to the clergy, not to the drug war, but to the clergy. And actually, exactly the opposite happened. Actually, the moral authority of the clergy who spoke out against the drug war, their moral authority went up in the popular opinion after they spoke out. So Yeah, so again, it's not a clean story that's going to save everything or solve everything in the short term, but I think that being present at the margins, speaking at the margins, speaking for the common good, not for your individual interests as the church, I do think that stuff works. It's hard though.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of leadership, and connecting to my research. So the book that was mentioned in the introduction, Days of Awe, Reimagining Jewishness in Solidarity with Palestinians, which actually looks specifically at a case study in Chicago, but also beyond that of American Jews who are interrogating the relationship to the political project of Israel. And at the center of that, there was an absolute, or there has been absolute outrage by the leadership and the teachers and the leaders and all the infrastructure. You know, the way that I kind of ethnographically traced that the prophetic was not in like a person, a leader. Like, I think that it is important to disrupt that conception of leadership. It's the movement, it's the social movement so to connect to the context of Palestine, Israel now. It's really important to look at the kind of the political geography as a whole, and to see and to have that historical lens that recognizes how colonialism, you know, through that deployed religion, you know, to divide communities, and to draw on what is called, you know, the counter archives. It's kind of like some of the things that I try to highlight through the people that the voices that I introduce. The counter archives, like, so for instance, there is an amazing memoir by Avi Schleim, who talks about his life in Iraq and the family of his family in Iraq before Zionism, before Israel brought them, basically drove them from Iraq together with local actors from Iraq to Palestine. They were put in mabarot, in camps, sprayed with DDT and so forth. But he talked about how, you know, living in that space before Zionism, before British colonialism started to meddle with things there, and without romanticizing anything, you know, people in his family recognized themselves as Baghdadi. Yes, they were Jewish too, but they were, you know, from Baghdad. So it really is important to recognize how his own story of dislocation connects to the Palestinian stories, and to look kind of intersectionally outside of the colonial binaries and divisions and fragmentation. It's a key, and that's exactly what wasn't there in that. You remember that image of the flags, the Israeli flags in the democracy protest, because all these people who did really amazing, you know, actions of civil disobedience, blocked roads, and fighting for democracy. But what democracy? I mean, this is a land where at least 7 million people, through different kind of mechanisms, are not, you know, don't live in a democracy, and 7 million think that they do. So in order to kind of like have any kind of like accountability, those kind of this myopia, and to trace how religion, you know, is deployed in order to generate and create those myopia is important. So hopefully that kind of responds a little bit to your point, your question.
Okay, so I'm going to put my moderator's hat on in two important things. First of all, please give our panelists a warm thank you once again. Yeah, thank you so much. And then secondly, I know we got some feedback in the mic, but I think I should pass this off to Bill, because I know that there's a whole day coming up tomorrow. This is just the beginning of the conference. Let me hand the mic to Bill to remind us what's coming up tomorrow morning.
Lots of good stuff. So we've got, starting at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, we have a panel on Theologies of Hope, and then a panel in the afternoon, early afternoon, on ecology, environmental concerns, and then another panel after that on church organizations and kind of grassroots organizing. So lots of good stuff tomorrow. So get some sleep, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.